The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee, like a shroud of forgotten memories. It was September 15, 2024, exactly 45 years since Reverend Matthew Sinclair Thornfield had vanished without a trace from the Cornerstone Baptist Church of Willowbrook Springs. The small town, nestled between the Cumberland Mountains and the Duck River, had never quite recovered from the mystery that shook its foundation of faith. Sarah Elizabeth Crawford stood before the weathered church building, her architectural surveying equipment heavy in her hands. At 34, she had built a reputation for restoring historic religious buildings across the South, but this project felt different. Personal. Her grandmother, Eleanor May Crawford, had been a devoted member of this congregation until her death 3 years ago, carrying secrets that she took to her grave. The church board had finally approved the restoration after decades of debate. The building, constructed in 1923, showed its age through peeling paint, sagging roof beams, and foundation issues that threatened its structural integrity. But beyond the physical decay lay something deeper, a spiritual wound that had never properly healed. "Miss Crawford?" A weathered voice called from behind her. Sarah turned to see Elder Thomas Benjamin Whitmore approaching, his 87-year-old frame moving slowly but with dignity. He had been the church's senior elder for over 50 years and one of the last remaining members who remembered Pastor Thornfield. "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah nodded respectfully. "Thank you for meeting me here so early." The elderly man's steel-blue eyes held depths of sorrow that 4.5 decades hadn't diminished. "I've been coming to this church since I was 12 years old, child. Seen 3 pastors come and go, but none like Matthew Thornfield. That man." He paused, gazing at the church's faded white steeple. That man carried the weight of this entire community on his shoulders. Sarah had heard fragments of the story throughout her childhood. Pastor Thornfield had arrived in Willowbrook Springs in 1976, a charismatic 32-year-old minister fresh from seminary with his wife, Rebecca Ann Thornfield, and their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, then only 4 years old. The family had breathed new life into the struggling congregation, drawing families from neighboring counties with Pastor Thornfield's powerful sermons and genuine compassion. What made him so special? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Her grandmother had spoken of him with a reverence usually reserved for biblical figures. Elder Whitmore's weathered hands clasped behind his back as he studied the church building. Matthew didn't just preach about God's love, he lived it. During the harsh winter of '78, when the coal mine closed and half our town was out of work, that man mortgaged his own house to keep food on tables and heat in homes. Never asked for recognition, never expected to be paid back. The morning sun broke through the mist, casting long shadows across the graveyard adjacent to the church. Rows of weathered headstones marked the resting places of generations of Willowbrook Springs families, but one grave that should have been there remained forever empty. "Tell me about the day he disappeared," Sarah said gently, knowing this was painful territory for the elderly man. Elder Whitmore's face darkened. September 15, 1979. A Saturday morning. Matthew had called a special meeting with the deacons for that evening. Said he had something important to discuss about the church's future. But when we arrived at 7 o'clock, the church was dark. Matthew's car was in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition, but he was nowhere to be found. Sarah felt a chill despite the warming morning air. And Mrs. Thornfield? Rebecca and the girls had gone to visit her sister in Nashville that weekend. Matthew was supposed to join them Sunday morning after church. When he didn't show up and didn't answer the phone, Rebecca drove back immediately. Found us all standing around like lost sheep, wondering where our shepherd had gone. The police investigation had been thorough but fruitless. Matthew Thornfield had simply vanished. No signs of foul play, no indication of financial trouble, no evidence of another woman or any reason to abandon his family and ministry. His personal belongings remained untouched in the parsonage, his study left exactly as he had prepared for Sunday's sermon on faith during trials. The church never really recovered, Elder Whitmore continued, his voice heavy with decades of grief. "Oh, we had other pastors come and go. Good men, mostly. But the congregation dwindled. People moved away, lost faith, or found other churches. The building's been slowly dying ever since, just like our hearts. Sarah opened her tablet and pulled up the architectural plans she had drawn based on her preliminary assessment. Mr. Whitmore, I need to ask you about some structural modifications I'm seeing. There are several walls and partitions that don't appear in the original 1923 blueprints. When were these added? The elder examined the plans carefully, his finger tracing the additions she had highlighted. Most of these were put in during the late 70s. Matthew was always trying to improve the building. Added that partition to create a private counseling office, expanded the choir loft, and put in that storage room behind the pulpit. He was handy with tools, did most of the work himself on weekends. Did he work alone? Sarah asked, making notes on her tablet. Usually. Matthew said working with his hands helped him think and pray. Rebecca used to joke that he was building more than just walls, he was building his sermons board by board. Elder Whitmore's expression grew distant. Strange thing was, in those last few weeks before he disappeared, he seemed to be tearing down as much as he was building. We'd come in Sunday mornings and find him covered in dust, having worked all night on some project in the church. Sarah felt her architectural instinct stirring. Structural modifications made shortly before a disappearance could be significant. Mr. Whitmore, I'll need to examine every modification he made. Sometimes they leave things behind. The elderly man nodded slowly. I've wondered for 45 years if Matthew left us some kind of message. Some explanation for why he had to go. That man wouldn't abandon his family and his calling without a powerful reason. As Elder Whitmore left for his morning doctor's appointment, Sarah began her detailed survey of the church interior. The sanctuary held 50 wooden pews arranged in 2 sections, facing a modest pulpit elevated on a platform. Behind the pulpit, a baptistry built into the wall bore witness to hundreds of spiritual rebirths over the decades. The modifications Pastor Thornfield had made were immediately apparent to her trained eye. The counseling office partition was expertly constructed but clearly added later than the original structure. The expanded choir loft required significant structural support that had been skillfully hidden. Most intriguing was the storage room behind the pulpit, a space that seemed larger from the outside than it appeared from within. Sarah pulled out her measuring tape and began calculating dimensions. The storage room measured 8 feet by 12 feet from the interior, but the exterior measurements suggested it should be at least 14 feet deep. 6 feet of space was unaccounted for. Hidden space, she murmured to herself, feeling the familiar thrill of architectural discovery. In her experience restoring old buildings, hidden spaces often contained the most significant historical artifacts. The storage room was cluttered with decades of accumulated church supplies, old hymnals, Christmas decorations, folding chairs, and boxes of miscellaneous items. Sarah began systematically moving everything out, looking for access to the missing 6 feet of space. As she lifted a heavy box of musty Sunday school materials from the back corner, her fingers detected a slight irregularity in the wood paneling. What appeared to be a solid wall had an almost imperceptible seam running vertically from floor to ceiling. Sarah examined the seam more carefully, running her hands along its length. Near the bottom, she found a small, cunningly concealed latch mechanism. When pressed, it released with a soft click, and a narrow section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges. Beyond the hidden door lay a small chamber, approximately 3 feet wide and 6 feet deep. The space was lined with cedar planks and contained a single wooden chair facing a makeshift desk created from a board supported by brackets. On the desk sat an oil lamp, a pen, and a leather-bound journal. Sarah's heart raced as she carefully lifted the journal. The leather cover was embossed with the initials, MST, and a small cross. Inside the front cover, in neat handwriting, was inscribed, "The private thoughts and struggles of Matthew Sinclair Thornfield, minister of God's word, shepherd of his flock, keeper of his secrets." With trembling hands, Sarah opened to the first entry, dated January 1, 1979. Lord God Almighty, I begin this year with a heavy heart and a troubled spirit. The burden you have placed upon me grows heavier with each passing day. I have discovered things about this community, about members of my own congregation, that challenge everything I believed about the nature of good and evil. Yet you have called me to be a shepherd, not a judge. Help me to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to trust in your divine justice. Sarah sank into the wooden chair, realizing she was sitting exactly where Pastor Thornfield had wrestled with whatever demons had ultimately led to his disappearance. The journal in her hands represented 45 years of unanswered questions, and possibly the key to solving one of Willowbrook Springs' greatest mysteries. She turned the page and continued reading. January 15, 1979, the Caldwell family came to me again today. Little Timothy, only 8 years old, with bruises that no child should bear. His father, Deacon James Caldwell, sits in the front pew every Sunday, leads our men's Bible study, and contributes generously to every church fund. Yet in the privacy of his home, he becomes a monster. Timothy's mother, Grace, begs me not to involve the authorities. She fears losing everything, her home, her social standing, her husband's income. But how can I, as a man of God, allow this child to suffer for the sake of appearances? Sarah felt sick to her stomach. The journal was revealing secrets that went far beyond simple church politics or personal struggles. She continued reading. February 2, 1979, Elder Harrison Montgomery came to my office today to discuss the church's finances. What he doesn't know is that I've been conducting my own examination of our books. Someone has been systematically embezzling from the building fund for over 2 years. The missing amount now exceeds $12,000. Money donated by faithful families who sacrificed their own needs to support God's work. The evidence points to someone with access to our accounts, someone trusted with our financial records. The revelation would destroy not just the guilty party, but the faith of our entire congregation. The entries grew increasingly troubled as winter turned to spring. Pastor Thornfield documented case after case of moral corruption hidden beneath the veneer of Christian respectability. Affairs among the church leadership, business fraud involving prominent members, and a conspiracy of silence that protected the powerful at the expense of the innocent. March 18, 1979, I can no longer bear this alone. The weight of these secrets is crushing my spirit and poisoning my relationship with God. How can I preach about truth and righteousness when I am complicit in covering up sin? Yet every person involved in these situations has begged me to maintain confidentiality. They trust me as their pastor, their counselor, their spiritual father. To expose them would be to betray that sacred trust. But to remain silent makes me an accomplice to their crimes. Sarah paused in her reading, overwhelmed by the moral complexity Pastor Thornfield had faced. As a minister, he was bound by pastoral confidentiality, yet as a human being and a member of the community, he was witnessing terrible injustices that demanded action. The afternoon sun streamed through the church windows, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the sanctuary. Sarah realized she had been reading for hours, completely absorbed in Pastor Thornfield's spiritual and ethical struggle. She checked her phone and saw 17 missed calls from various numbers, including Elder Whitmore and the current pastor, Reverend David Anthony Kingsfield. She called Elder Whitmore back first. His voice was filled with excitement and anxiety when he answered. Sarah. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours. Something extraordinary has happened. Mr. Whitmore, I need to tell you. Rebecca Thornfield is here, he interrupted. Matthew's widow. She drove down from Nashville this morning. Said she felt called to come back to Willowbrook Springs today, for the first time in 45 years. She's waiting at the parsonage and wants to speak with you about the restoration project. Sarah felt the hair on her arms stand up. The timing was too perfect to be mere coincidence. Mr. Whitmore, I've found something in the church. Something Pastor Thornfield left behind. Mrs. Thornfield needs to see this. What kind of something? A hidden room. And a journal. Mr. Whitmore, I think I know why Pastor Thornfield disappeared. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Elder Whitmore spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, God help us all. After 45 years, Matthew's finally ready to tell us the truth. Sarah carefully placed the journal in her messenger bag and made her way to the parsonage, a modest 2-story house that had remained empty since Pastor Thornfield's disappearance. The current pastor lived in a newer home on the other side of town, unable to bring himself to occupy the residence where so much mystery and heartache lingered. Rebecca and Thornfield stood on the front porch, now 79 years old but still carrying herself with the dignity and grace that had made her beloved by the congregation decades earlier. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and her deep blue eyes held a mixture of sorrow and determination that spoke of a woman who had spent 45 years preparing for this moment. "Mrs. Thornfield," Sarah said gently as she approached. "I'm Sarah Crawford. Thank you for coming." Rebecca studied Sarah's face intently, as if searching for something familiar. "You have your grandmother's eyes, child. Eleanor Crawford was my dearest friend during our time here. I've missed her terribly since she passed." Elder Whitmore emerged from the parsonage, having used his spare key to let Rebecca inside. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he addressed them both. "Ladies, before we go any further, I need to prepare you for what might be coming. If Sarah has found what I think she's found, we're about to learn things that could change everything we thought we knew about this church, this community, and the man we loved as our pastor." Rebecca's composure remained steady, but Sarah noticed her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Whitmore, I've lived with unanswered questions for 45 years. My daughters grew up believing their father abandoned them. I've endured decades of whispered rumors and suspicious glances from people who wondered if I knew more than I was telling. Whatever truth Sarah has discovered, it cannot be worse than the uncertainty I've carried all this time." Sarah pulled the journal from her bag and held it carefully in both hands. "Mrs. Thornfield, your husband didn't abandon you or his ministry. He was facing an impossible situation that would have tested any person's faith and integrity." She briefly explained the discovery of the hidden room and the contents of the journal's early entries. Rebecca listened in stunned silence, her eyes fixed on the leather-bound book that represented her husband's final months. "May I?" Rebecca asked, extending her hands toward the journal. Sarah placed it gently in Rebecca's hands, watching as the older woman opened to a random page and read her husband's familiar handwriting for the first time in nearly half a century. "August 14, 1979. I had hoped that confronting the guilty parties individually would lead to repentance and reform. Instead, I find myself entangled in a web of threats and manipulation. Deacon Caldwell has made it clear that any revelation of his abuse toward Timothy would result in consequences for my own family. Elder Montgomery warns that exposing the embezzlement would destroy not just him, but several other families whose livelihoods depend on his business. Mayor Watson has suggested that certain building permits for the church's expansion might be reconsidered if I prove to be a troublesome presence in the community. They believe they have me trapped between my pastoral duty and my love for Rebecca and the girls." Rebecca's hands trembled as she read, but her voice remained strong. "Matthew always said that the hardest part of ministry wasn't preaching to the choir, but knowing what to do when the choir was out of tune." Sarah and Elder Whitmore waited respectfully as Rebecca continued reading, watching decades of questions find their answers in her husband's own words. September 1, 1979. The situation has become untenable. I've discovered that the corruption runs deeper than I ever imagined. Judge Harold Preston, who has presided over family court cases for 15 years, has been taking bribes to ensure certain custody decisions favor those who can pay. Children have been placed in dangerous homes, torn from loving parents, all for money. The evidence is irrefutable, but Judge Preston is Elder Montgomery's brother-in-law and Mayor Watson's closest friend. To expose one would be to expose them all. September 5, 1979. I've reached my breaking point. This morning, little Timothy Caldwell came to church with a broken arm that his father claims resulted from a bicycle accident. The boy's eyes told a different story. I can no longer stand silent while children suffer for the sake of maintaining peace in my congregation. Yet if I speak out, the powerful men involved have made it clear that Rebecca and the girls will pay the price for my disloyalty. Rebecca looked up from the journal, tears streaming down her face. He was trying to protect us. All this time, I thought. I believed he might have stopped loving us, stopped believing in his calling. But he was trying to save innocent children while keeping his own family safe. Elder Whitmore sank into a porch chair, his face ashen. Judge Preston, he died in 1985. Mayor Watson moved to Florida in the early 80s. James Caldwell, my God, James Caldwell became county commissioner in 1982. If Matthew had spoken out. Read the final entries, Sarah urged gently. I think they explain what happened that Saturday night. Rebecca turned to the last pages of the journal, her hands steady despite the emotional weight of what she was learning. September 12, 1979. I have made my decision. I cannot continue to serve as pastor of this church while harboring these secrets. But neither can I expose the truth without destroying innocent lives along with the guilty. I have spent weeks in prayer, seeking God's guidance for an impossible situation. The answer came to me during last Sunday's sermon, when I spoke about Jesus' words, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." September 14, 1979, tomorrow night, I will meet with the deacons as planned. I will present them with copies of all the evidence I have gathered regarding the various corruptions in our community. I will give them 24 hours to come forward voluntarily and confess their sins to their families and to the appropriate authorities. If they refuse, I will take the evidence to the state police myself, regardless of the consequences to me or my family. September 15, 1979. It is 3 a.m. I cannot sleep, knowing what this day will bring. If I am reading this entry again, it means the confrontation with the deacons did not go as I hoped. If someone else is reading this, it means I am no longer able to tell my own story. To my beloved Rebecca, I love you more than words can express. You and hope and faith are the greatest blessings God ever gave me. Everything I have done has been to protect you and to protect the innocent children in our community. To my congregation, I hope you will understand that sometimes love requires difficult choices. A shepherd must be willing to face the wolves alone if it means saving the flock. The final entry was followed by several blank pages, and then, in different handwriting and clearly added much later, a single line, "He kept his word." E.M. Rebecca stared at the initials, her brow furrowed in concentration. "E.M., she whispered. "Elder Montgomery?" Sarah shook her head. "I think those are my grandmother's initials. Eleanor May Crawford." She knew something about what happened. Elder Whitmore stood up slowly, his aged frame moving with purpose for the first time that day. If Eleanor left a message in Matthew's journal, then she was involved somehow in whatever happened that night. We need to piece together September 15, 1979, hour by hour. Rebecca closed the journal and held it against her chest, as if embracing the husband she had lost so many years ago. Mr. Whitmore, who else is still alive from that time? Who else might remember details from that night? Besides myself, there are only 3 church members still living who were here in 1979, Dorothy Mae Phillips, who's 91 and in the nursing home but still sharp as a tack, Harold Eugene Stevens, Eleanor's brother, who lives over in the next county, and... He paused, his expression growing troubled. Virginia Lee Caldwell, James Caldwell's widow. She never spoke of what went on in her home, but if anyone knew the truth about her husband's violence, it would be her. Sarah felt the pieces of a 45-year-old puzzle beginning to form a picture, though the complete image remained frustratingly unclear. Mrs. Thornfield, the journal explains why your husband was struggling, but it doesn't tell us what actually happened to him that night. We need to talk to these people, and we need to search that hidden room more thoroughly. Rebecca nodded decisively. Then that's what we'll do. I've waited 45 years for the truth. I can wait a few more hours to get all of it. As the 3 of them prepared to return to the church, Sarah noticed storm clouds gathering over the Cumberland Mountains. The weather seemed fitting for the emotional tempest they were about to unleash by digging up secrets that had been buried for nearly half a century. The hidden room behind the church pulpit revealed additional secrets when examined more carefully. Sarah's architectural eye had missed several details during her initial excitement over finding the journal. The cedar-lined space contained built-in shelves that had been cleverly concealed behind removable panels. On these shelves, Pastor Thornfield had meticulously organized evidence of the corruption he had discovered, photocopied bank records, signed affidavits from abuse victims, photographs of suspicious meetings, and detailed notes documenting patterns of criminal behavior. Each piece of evidence was labeled and dated, creating a comprehensive case file that would have been devastating to the powerful men involved. Matthew was building a legal case, Rebecca observed as they carefully examined the documents. He wasn't just gathering information as a pastor, he was preparing for a criminal prosecution. Elder Whitmore studied a photograph that showed Judge Preston accepting an envelope from a man whose face was partially obscured. This must have taken months to compile. Matthew was more thorough than any private investigator. But it was Sarah who made the most significant discovery. As she examined the construction of the hidden room itself, she noticed that one section of the cedar paneling was newer than the rest. The wood grain didn't match perfectly, and the nails were a different type than those used in the original construction. This panel was added later, she told the others. Probably within the last few weeks before Pastor Thornfield disappeared. When they carefully removed the mismatched panel, they found a sealed envelope wedged into the wall cavity. The envelope was addressed in Pastor Thornfield's handwriting, to be opened only in the event of my death or disappearance. Rebecca's hands shook as she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. If you are reading this, then the worst has occurred, and I have paid the ultimate price for trying to protect both the innocent and the guilty. I pray that Rebecca and the girls are safe, but I fear that my efforts to shield them from the consequences of my moral stand have failed. The men whose crimes I have documented are desperate and dangerous. They have made it clear that they will stop at nothing to protect their secrets, including violence against my family. I have tried to find a solution that would expose the truth without destroying lives, but evil sometimes forces good people to make impossible choices. Hidden in this room is evidence of crimes that have hurt children, stolen from the faithful, and corrupted the very foundations of justice in our community. I have copies of everything in a safe deposit box at First National Bank in Nashville, along with instructions to release the information if anything happens to me. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my desk in the parsonage. To whoever finds this letter, please ensure that the evidence reaches honest law enforcement officials. The children being harmed deserve protection. The families whose money was stolen deserve justice. The community deserves leaders who serve God and the public good, not their own selfish interests. I go to meet my accusers with prayer in my heart and faith in God's ultimate justice. If I do not return, please tell Rebecca and the girls that every decision I made was motivated by love for them and love for the innocent. Sometimes a shepherd must face the wolves alone. The letter was signed and dated September 15, 1979, 5 p.m., just 2 hours before the scheduled meeting with the deacons. Elder Whitmore sat down heavily in the wooden chair, the weight of 45 years of guilt and regret evident in his posture. I was supposed to be at that meeting. We all were, the entire board of deacons. But at the last minute, James Caldwell called and said the meeting was being moved to his farm, that Matthew had asked for privacy to discuss sensitive matters. You didn't go? Rebecca asked, though her tone held no accusation. My wife was sick that evening with a terrible headache. I decided to stay home with her, figuring I could catch up on whatever was discussed at the next regular meeting. His voice broke slightly. If I had gone, if I had insisted on having the meeting here at the church as originally planned. Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. The meeting was moved to isolate Pastor Thornfield. Someone, probably James Caldwell, realized that your husband was preparing to expose them all. They lured him away from the church, away from potential witnesses. Rebecca stood and walked to the small window of the hidden room, gazing out at the graveyard where her husband should have been buried decades ago. We need to find that safe deposit box. If Matthew truly prepared evidence packages, then the Nashville police might still have an active case file somewhere. And we need to talk to the survivors, Sarah added. Mrs. Caldwell, Dorothy Phillips, Harold Stevens. Someone knows what happened that night. Elder Whitmore struggled to his feet, determination replacing despair in his expression. Then let's go find the truth that Matthew died trying to reveal. As they prepared to leave the hidden room, Sarah noticed one final detail that chilled her to the bone. Carved into the cedar wall, barely visible unless the light hit it just right, was a single word, help. The word was carved in the same careful script as Pastor Thornfield's journal entries, but the carving was rough and desperate, as if made with a pocket knife under extreme stress. Below it were scratched marks that might have been an attempt to keep track of days. He was held here, Sarah whispered. After the meeting, they brought him back here and kept him prisoner in his own church. Rebecca's face went white as she stared at the desperate message her husband had carved into the wall. How long? Elder Whitmore examined the scratch marks more carefully, counting them with his finger. 11 marks. If each represents a day. He looked up with horror in his eyes. Matthew was alive for almost 2 weeks after he disappeared. The revelation that Pastor Thornfield had been held captive in his own church for nearly 2 weeks sent shockwaves through the small group. The carefully planned disappearance they had been imagining was replaced by a much darker reality of kidnapping, imprisonment, and likely murder. Sarah's mind raced with the architectural implications. For someone to be held here for 2 weeks without being discovered, his captors would have needed complete control over access to the church. Who had keys? Elder Whitmore counted on his fingers: the pastor, myself, James Caldwell as head deacon, Harrison Montgomery as treasurer, and Dorothy Phillips as the church secretary. That's it. No one else had access. And Dorothy is 91 and in the nursing home, Rebecca observed. We need to speak with her immediately. The drive to Willowbrook Springs Care Center took 15 minutes through winding country roads that had changed little since 1979. Dorothy Mae Phillips occupied a private room overlooking the facility's garden, her mind still sharp despite her physical frailty. When they explained their discovery and showed her the journal, Dorothy's reaction was immediate and unexpected. She began to cry with what appeared to be relief. I've been waiting 45 years for someone to find that room, she said through her tears. I'm the one who wrote, he kept his word, in the journal. Eleanor Crawford and I were the only ones who knew the truth, and we promised each other we'd take it to our graves. But graves are lonely places for secrets. Rebecca leaned forward in her chair. Mrs. Phillips, what happened on September 15th? Dorothy's story unfolded like a confession that had been waiting decades to be heard. Matthew called me that afternoon and asked me to come to the church at midnight. Said he had evidence that would change everything, but he needed someone he trusted to witness what he was going to do with it. I was honored that he chose me, but I was also terrified by how scared he sounded. When I arrived at the church, Matthew was already there, along with James Caldwell, Harrison Montgomery, and Judge Preston. I didn't expect to see the judge, but Matthew had apparently demanded his presence as the highest-ranking official involved in the corruption. Dorothy paused to sip water from a cup with shaking hands. Matthew presented his evidence methodically, document by document. The men tried to deny everything at first, but the proof was overwhelming. When Matthew finished, he gave them exactly what he had promised in his letter: 24 hours to confess voluntarily, or he would take everything to the state police. That's when things turned violent. Sarah asked gently. Judge Preston lost his temper first. Started screaming about how Matthew was destroying innocent families, how exposure would ruin more than just the guilty parties. Harrison Montgomery tried to offer Matthew money, a lot of money, to keep quiet. But Matthew just stood there, calm as could be, and said, I can't be bought, and innocent children can't wait any longer for justice. Rebecca reached for Elder Whitmore's hand, needing human contact as she heard the story of her husband's final hours of freedom. James Caldwell was the one who suggested they needed time to think, that maybe they could work out some kind of compromise. He asked Matthew to wait in his office while they discussed their options privately. Matthew agreed, but as soon as he left the sanctuary, Caldwell locked the office door from the outside. Dorothy's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if telling the truth was giving her energy. They held him prisoner for 11 days. Brought him food and water, tried every day to convince him to change his mind. Offered him money, threatened his family, even suggested they could arrange for him to be transferred to a church in another state where he could start fresh. But he wouldn't give in. Matthew Thornfield was the most stubborn man I ever knew when it came to doing what he believed was right. Every morning, one of them would visit him and ask if he was ready to be reasonable. Every morning, Matthew would say the same thing: release me so I can do what God has called me to do, or kill me and face his judgment. Sarah felt sick as she imagined the gentle pastor trapped in the small hidden room, refusing to compromise his principles even under the threat of death. On the 11th night, September 26th, they finally realized he was never going to change his mind. Judge Preston came to the church around midnight with two men I didn't recognize, rough-looking men from out of town. They dragged Matthew out of the church and... Dorothy's voice faltered. "How do you know all this?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because Eleanor Crawford and I took shifts watching the church every night. We were the only ones who knew Matthew was being held there, and we were too scared to go to the police ourselves. We thought if we just watched, maybe we could help him somehow." Elder Whitmore stared at Dorothy in amazement. "You and Eleanor kept vigil for 11 days?" "We did. And on that last night, we followed them." Dorothy closed her eyes as if the memory was still too painful to see clearly. "They took Matthew to the old quarry about 20 miles east of town. Judge Preston shot him twice in the chest and they threw his body into the deepest part of the water." The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the nursing home's ventilation system. Outside Dorothy's window, a cardinal perched on a bird feeder, its bright red plumage a stark contrast to the darkness of the story being told. Rebecca spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Why didn't you and my grandmother go to the police afterward?" Dorothy opened her eyes and looked directly at Rebecca. "Because Judge Preston threatened to kill Matthew's family if anyone ever spoke about what had happened. Said he'd make it look like a car accident or a home invasion. Eleanor and I decided that protecting you and the girls was more important than getting justice for Matthew." "And the evidence he had prepared?" "Eleanor and I broke into the parsonage 3 days later and cleaned out his desk. Found the key to the safe deposit box, just like Matthew had written in his letter. But when we went to the bank in Nashville, the box had already been emptied. Harrison Montgomery had somehow gotten access and destroyed everything." Sarah sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the cover-up. "So all these years, these men just went on with their lives as if nothing had happened?" "Judge Preston died in 1985, liver cancer. Harrison Montgomery moved to Florida in 1982, and died there in the early 90s. James Caldwell became a county commissioner and lived another 20 years, died in 1999. The two men who actually did the physical work, we never learned their names." Rebecca stood and walked to the window, her shoulders squared with new resolve. "Mrs. Phillips, that quarry, is it still there?" "Far as I know. Though it's been filled with water for decades now. Must be 100 feet deep in some places." Elder Whitmore spoke quietly, "We need to call the police. Even after all these years, this is still a murder case." But it was Sarah who raised the practical concern. With all the principal suspects dead and no physical evidence, what can the police actually do? "Mrs. Phillips' testimony is compelling, but legally..." Dorothy reached for Rebecca's hand with surprising strength. "There's one more thing, dear. Something Eleanor and I never told anyone, not even each other until years later. On that last night, when they took Matthew to the quarry, Eleanor managed to get close enough to take pictures." The revelation hit the room like lightning. "Pictures?" Rebecca gasped. Eleanor always carried her camera, she was the unofficial church photographer. When we followed them that night, she brought it along. Got several pictures of them loading Matthew into the car, and one clear shot of Judge Preston with the gun. "Where are those pictures now?" Dorothy smiled for the first time since they had arrived. Eleanor hid them in the same place she hid everything else important to her. "The family Bible. When she gave that Bible to your grandmother Sarah before she died, she made her promise to give it to you when the time was right." Sarah's heart raced as she remembered cleaning out her grandmother's house after her death. The old family Bible was still there, sitting on her bookshelf at home, unopened since the funeral. "The pictures are in grandmother's Bible?" she asked, though she somehow already knew the answer. "Taped inside the back cover. Eleanor said when God was ready for the truth to come out, he'd make sure the right person found them." As they prepared to leave the nursing home, Dorothy called out one final message. "Tell Matthew I kept faith with him all these years. Tell him I never stopped believing he was the best man I ever knew." The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as Sarah, Rebecca, and Elder Whitmore made their way back to town. Thunder rolled across the Cumberland Mountains, and lightning illuminated the darkening sky in brilliant flashes that seemed to mirror the emotional revelations of the day. Sarah's house was a modest cottage on the outskirts of Willowbrook Springs, inherited from her grandmother and filled with a lifetime's worth of memories. As they stood in her living room, dripping rain and anxiety, the large family Bible seemed to dominate the room despite sitting quietly on its shelf. "I haven't opened it since grandmother's funeral," Sarah admitted as she carefully lifted the heavy book. "She always said it contained our family's most important history." The Bible was a 1943 edition with a worn leather cover and pages yellowed by age. As Sarah opened to the back cover, she found exactly what Dorothy Phillips had described, a manila envelope taped securely inside the back cover, with "For the Truth" written in Eleanor Crawford's careful handwriting. Inside the envelope were 4 black and white photographs, remarkably clear despite being taken in darkness 45 years earlier. The first showed Pastor Thornfield being forcibly led from the church by 3 men. The second captured him being pushed into a car trunk. The third was a clear shot of Judge Preston holding a revolver beside the quarry. The fourth photograph was the most devastating, Pastor Thornfield kneeling by the quarry's edge, his hands bound behind his back, looking directly into the camera with an expression of peace rather than fear. Rebecca's knees buckled as she saw her husband for the first time in 45 years. Elder Whitmore caught her arm and helped her to a chair, his own face pale with shock. "He knew," Rebecca whispered. "Look at his face." He knew Eleanor was there with the camera. He knew this moment would be recorded. Sarah studied the photographs with her trained eye for detail. "These aren't just evidence of murder, they're evidence of premeditation. Judge Preston is clearly in charge, and the other men are following his orders." "What do we do now?" Elder Whitmore asked. "These photographs change everything." Rebecca stood up, her grief transformed into steely determination. "Now we give Matthew the justice he died trying to achieve. We call the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, we call the Nashville Police, we call anyone who will listen. My husband gave his life to protect innocent children and expose corruption. The least we can do is make sure his sacrifice meant something." As Sarah reached for her phone to call the authorities, a loud knock at the front door stopped her cold. Through the window, she could see the silhouette of a man in a police uniform, illuminated by flashes of lightning. Elder Whitmore moved to the window and peered out. "It's Sheriff Douglas Patterson. He must have seen our cars and wondered what we were up to." But as Sheriff Patterson entered the house, shaking rain from his uniform, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Pinned to his uniform shirt was a name tag that read D. Patterson, but hanging from his key chain was a small brass nameplate that said J. Caldwell. Sheriff Patterson was James Caldwell's son. "Evening, folks," Sheriff Patterson said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite a storm we're having. I saw lights on and wanted to make sure everything was all right. Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Thornfield, Miss Crawford, you all seem to be having quite an intense conversation." Sarah discreetly closed the Bible, but not before Sheriff Patterson's sharp eyes noticed the photographs scattered on the coffee table. "Now, those look like some interesting old pictures," he said, moving closer. "Mind if I take a look?" The 3 of them stood frozen, realizing they had walked into a trap 45 years in the making. Sheriff Douglas Patterson wasn't just James Caldwell's son, he was the guardian of his father's secrets, and he had been watching their investigation from the beginning. "Sheriff Patterson," Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice steady, "we were just looking through some old family photographs. Nothing that would interest law enforcement." But Patterson had already seen enough to understand what they had discovered. His hand moved casually to rest on his service weapon, and his demeanor shifted from friendly concern to cold calculation. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm afraid these photographs interest me very much. You see, my father told me before he died that someday, someone might come asking questions about Pastor Thornfield. He made me promise to make sure those questions never got answered." Elder Whitmore stepped forward, his aged frame still carrying the dignity of a man who had served God faithfully for decades. "Douglas, your father was involved in terrible crimes. Children were hurt, money was stolen, and a good man was murdered. You don't have to perpetuate his sins." "My father was a pillar of this community," Patterson replied, his voice hardening. He built businesses, created jobs, served in public office. Whatever mistakes he may have made don't erase the good he did. Sarah felt the weight of her architectural training as she quickly assessed the room for exits and potential weapons. The front door was blocked by Patterson, but the kitchen had a back door that led to her grandmother's garden. "Sheriff," Sarah said carefully, "we haven't broken any laws by discovering historical documents. These photographs are evidence of crimes committed decades ago by men who are now dead. What possible purpose could there be in suppressing them now?" Patterson's laugh was bitter and cold. "Miss Crawford, you have no idea how deep this goes. My father wasn't the only one with secrets to protect. Judge Preston had a son who became a federal prosecutor. Harrison Montgomery's nephew runs the biggest bank in the county. When you expose one corrupt family, you destroy the foundations that other families have built their lives on." Rebecca moved slightly toward the Bible, trying to protect the photographs. "So you're going to kill us to protect reputations? To cover up crimes that happened before you were even born?" "I'm going to protect my community from troublemakers who want to destroy people's faith in their institutions," Patterson replied, his hand now gripping his weapon. "Sometimes peace requires difficult choices." The irony of his words, so similar to what Pastor Thornfield had written in his journal, was lost on none of them. But before Patterson could draw his weapon, the lights went out. The storm had knocked out power to Sarah's neighborhood, plunging them into darkness broken only by lightning flashes. In the confusion, Sarah grabbed the Bible and photographs, shoved them into Elder Whitmore's hands, and whispered urgently, "Back door. Go to the church. Call for help." As Patterson fumbled for his flashlight, the three of them moved quickly through Sarah's house toward the kitchen. Elder Whitmore, despite his age, moved with surprising agility when motivated by necessity. Rebecca stayed close behind him, while Sarah deliberately knocked over furniture to slow Patterson's pursuit. They burst through the back door into the storm, rain immediately soaking them to the skin. The church was only 3 blocks away, but the journey through dark streets felt like an eternity as they listened for sounds of pursuit behind them. When they reached Cornerstone Baptist Church, Sarah used her key to let them into the sanctuary. The familiar space felt different in the darkness, more like a refuge than a crime scene. "We need to call the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation," Rebecca said as she caught her breath. "Sheriff Patterson obviously can't be trusted." Elder Whitmore pulled out his cell phone, but there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers too. Sarah remembered the old landline phone in the church office. "This way," she whispered, leading them through the darkened hallway. As they reached the office, the lights suddenly came back on. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Patterson's patrol car pulling into the church parking lot, his emergency lights flashing red and blue against the rain-soaked night. "He's here," Sarah whispered. "We're trapped." But Elder Whitmore smiled for the first time that evening. "No, child. We're not trapped. We're exactly where we need to be." He pointed to the old church bell tower, accessible through a narrow staircase behind the office. "That bell has been ringing out truth over this community for over a century. Time to let it ring again." As Sheriff Patterson entered the church building, shouting threats and demands for surrender, the three of them climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower. Elder Whitmore, with strength that belied his 87 years, began ringing the bell with the measured, urgent pattern that had traditionally called the community to emergency gatherings. The sound echoed across Willowbrook Springs like a voice from the past, waking sleeping families and drawing the curious from their homes despite the storm. Within minutes, cars began arriving at the church as community members responded to the bell's ancient call. Sheriff Patterson found himself facing not 3 frightened witnesses, but an entire congregation that had come to see what emergency required the bell to ring at midnight in a thunderstorm. As Patterson tried to explain his presence with weapons drawn in God's house, Elder Whitmore descended from the bell tower carrying the Bible and photographs. Standing before the hastily gathered crowd, he spoke with the authority of a man who had served faithfully for over half a century. "Friends and neighbors, tonight we have learned the truth about what happened to Pastor Matthew Thornfield in 1979. For 45 years, good people have carried the weight of unanswered questions and unfinished grief. Tonight, by God's grace, those questions have been answered. He held up the photographs for all to see. These pictures were taken on the night Pastor Thornfield was murdered by corrupt officials who feared the truth he was prepared to reveal. They killed him to protect their secrets, and they have threatened to kill again to keep those secrets buried. The crowd murmured in shock and anger as they recognized Judge Preston in the photographs. Sheriff Patterson tried to maintain control, but his authority crumbled in the face of documentary evidence and community outrage. Sheriff Patterson has threatened us tonight because we discovered evidence of his father's crimes, Rebecca announced, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. But the truth belongs to this community, not to those who would suppress it for their own benefit. As if summoned by divine intervention, the sound of additional sirens filled the night. State police vehicles, alerted by concerned citizens who had seen the emergency lights and heard the bell, arrived to investigate what appeared to be a significant incident at the church. When Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents examined the photographs and heard the testimony of Dorothy Phillips, who had been contacted by phone and agreed to speak, the case of Pastor Matthew Thornfield's disappearance was officially reopened as a homicide investigation. Sheriff Patterson was arrested on charges of intimidating witnesses and obstruction of justice. The photographs became evidence in a case that would ultimately expose a decades-old conspiracy involving multiple officials and lead to significant reforms in local government oversight. 3 months later, professional divers recovered Pastor Matthew Thornfield's remains from the quarry, along with the gun that had killed him. DNA evidence confirmed his identity, and ballistics tests matched the weapon to other unsolved crimes from the late 1970s. On a bright Saturday morning in December 2024, exactly 45 years and 3 months after his disappearance, Pastor Matthew Sinclair Thornfield was finally laid to rest in the cemetery beside Cornerstone Baptist Church. The funeral drew over 1,000 people from across Tennessee, including many whose lives had been touched by his story of courage and sacrifice. Rebecca Thornfield, now 80 years old, stood beside the grave with her daughters Hope and Faith, both now married with children of their own. For the first time in 45 years, they had answers. More importantly, they had proof that their husband and father had died as he had lived, defending the innocent and standing for truth regardless of personal cost. Elder Thomas Whitmore, despite his advanced age, delivered the eulogy with a voice that carried across the crowd like a bell ringing out truth. Matthew Thornfield taught us that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not in preaching about God's love, but in demonstrating it through sacrifice. He chose to face evil rather than allow innocent children to continue suffering. He chose truth over safety, justice over comfort, righteousness over reputation. Today we bury his earthly remains, but his legacy lives on in every person who chooses to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, who stands with the vulnerable against the powerful, who believes that truth is worth any sacrifice. Sarah Crawford, who had been instrumental in solving the case, announced the establishment of the Matthew Thornfield Foundation for Child Protection, funded by donations from across the country. The foundation would work to identify and assist children in abusive situations, ensuring that Pastor Thornfield's mission to protect the innocent would continue long after his earthly ministry had ended. As the mourners departed and the cemetery grew quiet, Rebecca remained beside the grave, finally able to say the goodbye she had been denied for nearly half a century. "Matthew," she whispered, "you kept your word. You protected us, you protected the children, and you showed us all what real faith looks like. I'm so proud to have been your wife." The wind rustled through the trees surrounding the cemetery, and Rebecca felt a peace she hadn't experienced since that terrible morning when her husband failed to come home. The questions that had haunted her for 45 years were finally answered, and the man she had loved was finally home. Above them, the bell tower of Cornerstone Baptist Church stood silent in the winter air, but its message had already been proclaimed: truth will always find a way to rise from the depths where evil tries to bury it, and justice, though delayed, will never be denied. In his hidden journal, Pastor Matthew Thornfield had written, "Sometimes a shepherd must face the wolves alone." But in the end, he hadn't faced them alone. God had provided witnesses to record his sacrifice, guardians to preserve the evidence, and ultimately, the courage for others to continue his fight for truth and justice. The pastor who disappeared in 1979 had finally come home, and his secrets of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering faith, would inspire generations to come.